Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video I'm going to explore the question of whether moral relativists can criticize the moral views or the moral code of other cultures. Now, there were some comments in my video on atheism and moral nihilism claiming relativists could criticize other cultures' moral codes. A few even went so far as to claim I misunderstood or misrepresented certain aspects of relativism, though considering the fact that I'm citing actual philosophers who published in this area, I'd say it's actually these critics who are misunderstanding the literature, and this is especially the case in light of James Rachels' paper on the challenge of cultural relativism, which I cited and explicitly quoted from. So by extension, these critics would, I guess, also be accusing him, an actual moral philosophy professor, of misunderstanding and misrepresenting moral philosophy. Now, to get started, consider a culture like Saudi Arabia, or a country like Saudi Arabia, where homosexuality is punishable by death. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to make any normative judgments about homosexuality or Saudi Arabia. I'm just using this as a current example because I think it's a good example because for those of us in the West, this is a very shocking idea. Now, relativists in the US are free to criticize Saudi Arabia of failing to conform to their own standards. And of course, relativists in Saudi Arabia are also free to criticize those in the US for legally protecting homosexuality. A citizen of each of these countries or cultures can criticize the other for failing to conform for their standards, and this point is just trivially true. In fact, under any form of relativism, one can criticize others for failing to conform to their own views. I mean, I can criticize people who like pineapple on their pizza for liking something I don't, even if, I'm a gastronomical relativist. But this misses the whole point of Rachel's and, among others, criticism of cultural relativism. The question isn't whether or not people engage in this sort of criticism, uttering the words, quote, "this culture is wrong because it fails to conform to my standards," but instead, what these criticisms are based on and whether they have warrant. In other words, whether these criticisms are based on fact or fallacy. The problem of moral criticism under cultural relativism is that it becomes arbitrary. The point being, if you were born in the US, you would be criticizing Saudi Arabia's policies on homosexuality. Whereas if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would be criticizing the US's policy on homosexuality. And if you didn't actually under relativism, you would be failing to adhere to cultural relativism itself. Put another way, it's basically an accident of birth that you hold the current moral beliefs and criticisms that you do. And you could say this in some way forms a genetic debunking argument. Now, someone could object that this commits the genetic fallacy. I mean, after all, couldn't someone be born into the culture that has the right set of moral views? This is wrong because cultural relativism denies there's any metacultural right set of moral beliefs by definition. So this doesn't work, and this objection would betray a misunderstanding of relativism itself. And there are other problems here, other challenges as well. Suppose you're, a petroleum engineer who moves to Saudi Arabia because of your job. Do you need to be acclimated to a new moral culture? Should your moral beliefs update to favor punishing homosexuality by death because you are entering a new culture? Well, this depends on what forms the basis of your culture, whether it is where you live, where you're born, maybe some combination of each. Perhaps it adapts over time. So as you become acclimated, perhaps you should, under relativism, become more and more supportive of executing homosexuals because this is more and more part of your own culture if you were to move to a country like this. But regardless, the fundamental issue here is what reason is there to think that accidental properties like where and when you're born is necessarily a good reason to hold certain beliefs, and moral beliefs are no exception here. And note the relativists cannot even claim their own set of beliefs as capital T true or objectively true because they hold to relativism. So by believing in relativism, they must abandon honest criticism of other cultures, including non-relativistic cultures, because under relativism, they would believe in a different moral code if they were born just accidentally in a different culture. So this is what moral philosophers mean when they say relativists cannot criticize other cultures. We don't have any reason to believe our cultural criticism holds any weight or means anything under relativism. This is because we have no way of arbitrating between our own moral criticism and the moral criticism of others outside of our own culture, except basically criticizing where the person was born. And the relativists themselves doesn't think that there's any place one could be born that has a better or more true moral code because this commits the kind of metacultural criticism that relativism forbids a priori. So it's clear a relativist can utter the words, "Saudi Arabia is wrong in their treatment of homosexuals because it doesn't align with my culture." But they have no objective reason to think this is superior to someone saying America is wrong in their treatment of homosexuals because it doesn't align with Saudi Arabia's. And they have every reason to think that if they were born in Saudi Arabia, they would agree with Saudi Arabia's stance on homosexuality. In fact, many would make a normative judgment and say, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you should agree with your local culture's views and cultural criticisms as well. As a result, cultural relativism ends up destroying itself. Other cultures are absolute and not relativist at all. So if you were born into a non-relative moral culture, then by moral relativism, you should abandon moral relativism altogether. Moral relativists are thus claiming that it is objectively true that moral beliefs are only subjectively true, which is actually very difficult for me to understand. But let's see an example. For instance, Saudi Arabia does not believe morality is relative at all. So relative to Saudi Arabia, their citizens under relativism should deny relativism itself. And to me, this is just absurd, and it shows that relativism is self-referentially incoherent. Now, one way a relativist could try to get around this would be to claim that metaethical judgments, like relativism itself, could be objectively true, while normative judgments like killing homosexuals would be relative. But I don't think this works, because as soon as metaethical beliefs have normativity attached, it becomes immoral to believe in relativism under relativism if you live somewhere like Saudi Arabia. Thus, under relativism, if relativism is true, belief in the truth of relativism itself would be immoral if you were born into a place like Saudi Arabia that denies relativism, which I just think is pretty ridiculous. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I think if there's one thing we should learn from Saudi Arabia, it is that we shouldn't believe in moral relativism. Anyway, have a good one.